Good morning, all. In today's session, we'll be learning about process of physiology of learning and memory. At the end of this session, students will be able to understand what are the various definition of learning and memory, classification of memory and learning, types and significances of conditioned reflexes, what are the various mechanisms involved that are responsible for learning and memory, various brain areas responsible for learning and memory, and at the last, what is the physiological basis of various abnormalities that are related with the learning as well as the memory. Let us begin with the definitions. Learning, it can be defined as acquirement of information or knowledge by experience that results in the alteration of behavior. And memory, it is the ability to store the information and to recall it as and when needed. That means the stored information should be retrieved and utilized at any time in life whenever needed. Memory mainly has got four important stages. The first among which is the registration of memory that takes place, which includes the proper perception and attention. Failure of learning and memory is resulting whenever there will be impaired perception as well as attention, and because material to be learned is never registered and assimilated. Second stage is integration and retention. Learned experiences are processed and integrated by various structures in the central nervous system and then retained at appropriate pace in the brain in the form of short-term or long-term memory. Third stage is recognition and recall. At appropriate time and place, memory is recalled for proper use. And reutilization, memory, which is now has become the experience for the person. And this experience has got learned. And therefore, memory can be a learned experience which will be utilized for improvement of further learning or further behavior. Let us classify memory. It is mainly of two varieties, explicit and second is implicit memory. Explicit memory is also called declarative memory, which is memory of facts, which is called semantic memory, and memory of events, episodic memory. It is of two varieties, short term and long term. Implicit or non-declarative memory. It involves priming, procedural memory, which includes skills and habits, non-associative learning, which includes habituation and sensitization, and associative learning, which is including classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Let us consider one by one. Explicit memory or declarative memory. It is connected with awareness and has two forms. Memories of various events, that is called episodic memory. That means the memory has developed for a particular episode that the person has undergone. And memories of facts, which is called as semantic memory. It is dependent on hippocampus and other parts of the medial temporal lobes of the brain for its retention. As we said, it is having two forms, short term and long term. What is short term? This kind of memory lasts for second to hours, during which processing in the hippocampus and elsewhere in the brain lays down long-term changes in the synaptic strength. For example, working memory. As we said, working memory. This makes the information available for a brief period. As a result of repeated training, short-term memory can be transferred into a long-term memory, and this is happening, that conversion of short-term into long-term memory by the process called consolidation. Memory traces in case of short-term memory are subject to disruption whenever there is a trauma or may be responsible because of various drugs. Long-term, it is opposite to short-term, that is information is stored for years together and maybe sometimes for the rest of the life. Its traces are remarkably resistant to the disruption, either because of the trauma or because of the various kind of drugs. This particular memory is broadly divided into explicit and implicit memory. Implicit memory, which is also called reflexive or non-declarative memory. It is not associated with awareness and includes skills, habits, priming, conditioned reflexes, etc. Explicit memory is initially required to develop this kind of implicit memory. For example, whenever a person is learning to drive, maybe it's a car, we can take example. Initially, he remembers or she remembers the step for changing the gears of the car. That means the changes gears with conscious knowledge. Is at the initial phase very much cautious or conscious while changing the gear. As this is repeated for number of time, it becomes a reflexive in nature, and which is developing habit to do so. That means now the person is able to change the gear without being conscious all the time about the same. And once the skill is developed or acquired, the acts become unconscious as well as automatic. This we all have experienced if we have gone through the process of learning how to drive the car. Priming. It is the facilitation of recognition of words or objects by prior exposure to them. For example, improved recall of a word when presented with first few letters of it. Procedural memory. It includes skills and habits, which once acquired becomes unconscious and automatic. Like we took example of driving of a car or how learning how to drive a car. Non-associative learning. Organism learns about a single stimulus. For example, habituation and sensitization. Organism learns about a single stimulus. And for example is habituation and sensitization. What is habituation? A simple form of learning in which neutral stimulus is repeated many times. First time the stimulus is applied, it is very new or novel, and it evokes a particular reaction. That is orienting reflex, or what is it response, because person is maybe not recognizing what particular kind of stimulus is being received because it is completely new. Further, it evokes less and less response as the stimulus is repeated, and because the response is getting less and less as the stimulus or similar kind of stimulus is getting repeated, the particular process is termed habituation. Eventually, subject becomes habituated to the stimulus and ignores it ultimately. This is because of inhibition of synaptic pathways for this type of particular information, and it is a type of negative memory. Habituation is a classical example of non-associative learning. Coming on to sensitization, which is exactly opposite to the habituation. Repeated application of stimulus evokes greater and greater response, and therefore we are saying it is opposite to habituation. If it is coupled one or more times with noxious, that means unpleasant or non-noxious stimulus, or the pleasant. It is a type of positive memory. Arousal value of stimuli occur in humans. For example, this we have seen in our day-to-day life. The mother who is sleeping through many kinds of noises very silently and calmly, but waking up very promptly and suddenly when her baby cries. Associative learning. Organism learns about relation of one stimulus with the other. For example, conditioned reflex. How can we define conditioned reflex? It is a reflex response to a stimulus that previously elicited only little or no response at all. It is acquired by repeatedly pairing the stimulus with another stimulus that normally does produce the response, and therefore said is labeled as conditioned reflex because it is elicited only after the application or pairing of the additionals. Types of conditioned reflexes: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Conditioned reflexes have two components which are associated with emotional responses. This particular phenomena is regulated by amygdala of the limbic system, and motor responses which are controlled by the cerebellum. Classical conditioning. First of all, we should know what is the unconditioned stimulus and what is a conditioned stimulus. Unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus that normally elicits a specific innate response. That means for this particular kind of stimulus, whatever response is elicited, that is present in the individual right since the birth. It is not learned, but it is present right since the birth, and hence it is said to be the unconditioned stimulus. Conditioned stimulus that normally does not produce any response, but on application does produce a significant response when paired with the unconditioned stimulus. And therefore, what is the condition here? That this particular stimulus is to be paired with unconditioned stimulus. That means this particular stimulus we can label as the conditioned stimulus. For example, Ian Pavlov's experiment. First, produce the salivation in a dog by placing a piece of meat in his mouth. That means the dog is presented with a meat and or kept a piece of meat in the dog's mouth that leads to salivation, which is a conditioned stimulus. Then he rung a bell just before placing the meat in the dog's mouth. That means this is an unconditioned, as we can see here the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response before conditioning, and during conditioning, bell plus food. Repeated it number of times till the animal was made to salivate with bell and ringing. Finally, without even placing the bit in a mouth. And therefore, it is said to be the Ian Pavlov's experiment. What basically done here is dog is presented with the piece of meat, and with the vision of that meat only he got salivated. And before presenting meat, the bell was rung, uh, and then the meat was presented. And in the third step, only the bell was rung and no meat was presented. And even after that, the dog was salivating. And this is because of the classical conditioning that has got. Inhibition of conditioned reflex. It occurs in two ways: internal inhibition and external inhibition. Internal, if the conditioned stimulus is presented indefinitely without unconditioned stimulus, the response decreases and eventually stops. External inhibition, if animal is disturbed externally just after the application of conditioned stimulus, the conditioned reflex will be inhibited. What is reinforcement of the conditioned reflex? It is difficult to maintain the conditioned reflex indefinitely, but if conditioned stimulus is paired repeatedly with unconditioned stimulus from time to time, conditioned reflex becomes permanent. And this, when the conditioned reflex is becoming permanent, this phenomenon is referred to as reinforcement of conditioned reflex, which is of, there are two kinds of reinforcement, positive as well as negative. If the unconditioned stimulus is associated with latent effect, it is said to be positive reinforcement, and if it is associated with an unpleasant effect, it will be labeled as negative reinforcement. Coming on to operant conditioning. After the classical conditioning, operant conditioning. Before we proceed with the operant conditioning, I think there is one mistake made over here. This particular stimulus, for the first time, which is being given, is the unconditioned stimulus. It's by mistake it is being typed over here, and this is the bell is rung. That is the conditioned stimulus. So you please make it correction while you will be following or going through this particular. Coming on to operant conditioning, animal is trained to perform a task for either to receive a reward or to avoid a punishment. Here, the animal is trained, or we can say the animal is learning to perform a task by which it can receive a reward or it can avoid the punishment. Unconditioned stimulus may be pleasant or unpleasant event. Conditioned stimulus is applied as a signal in the form of light or sound that alters the or that alerts the animal to perform. And this particular operant conditioning is extensively studied by B.F. Skinner, an American psychologist who studied this particular type of conditioning by keeping the rat in a box named after him, that is a Skinner box, in which that means in this particular box, the provision is made in such a way that the animal, when presses the bar, which is a conditioned stimulus, results in delivery of food pellet. Or if the another provision is made that when the animal is pressing the bar, it prevents application of electric shock to the animal. That means animal here is learning about how the food is obtained by pressing the bar, because it is a present. Therefore, it is said to be a positive reinforcement because it is permanent. We can say conditioned reflex, and the shock is prevented by pressing a bar, which is as it is a unpleasant event. Hence, it is said to be the negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is also called conditioned avoidance reflex or aversion conditioning, as conditioned motor response results in avoidance of electric shock. Another example of negative reinforcement, animal severely develops aversion to a particular food. If the test of food, which is unconditioned stimulus, is coupled with injection of a chemical which is responsible for developing physical illness. So a permanent aversion to that particular food will be developed, which is a kind of negative reinforcement. Clinical significance of operant conditioning. Aversion conditioning occurs in humans also. Food aversion is a very strong in human if the food is associated with illness developed by application of a conditioned stimulus. This helps in avoiding ingestion of poisonous food. And therefore, this type of learning becomes very much significant, not only in animal, but in cases of human beings. Mechanism, various mechanisms which are underlying learning and memory. They are divided into cellular or the molecular mechanism, neural mechanism, and biochemical mechanism. In this particular session, we'll be discussing about cellular or the molecular mechanism. Cellular or molecular mechanism mainly include the neurochemical changes while learning and memory, and these changes in the form of increased synaptic connections, neurotransmitter secretion, formation of intracellular second messengers, protein synthesis, and gene activation. Sensitization and habituation. What is happening? It occurs due to change in neurotransmitter release at the sensory neuronal ending and due to alteration in the intracellular calcium ions. Habituation. In habituation, we know it is occurring as repeated application of a particular stimulus. When there is repeated application of particular stimulus, gradually it causes inactivation of the calcium channel. Therefore, there occur decreased calcium content at the presynaptic terminal, and therefore there will be less and less release of neurotransmitter by the presynaptic nerve terminal, that is from the presynaptic sensory ending, and that develops the habituation. Sensitization, as it is reverse to habituation, here the main reason is prolongation of action potential after application of repeated stimulus when the sensory ending takes place, and this prolongation of action potential keeps the calcium channel, voltage gated calcium channel, open for much duration of time, which increases the intracellular calcium ion concentration and thereby increase the neurotransmitter release by the process of exocytosis. Thus, sensitization is because of the presynaptic fascination. Conditioned reflexes. In classical conditioning, pairing of unconditioned stimulus with the conditioned stimulus is taking place, which activate the presynaptic neuron, which causes adenyl cyclase to be activated to a greater extent, and this is leading to the formation of more and more cyclic AMP, which is the second message. This formed cyclic MP is responsible for phosphorylation and closure of potassium channels, which causes slow repolarization and thereby prolongs the action potential. As the action potential is prolonged, there occurs increase in the calcium ion concentration and there occurs presynaptic fascination. Post-tetanic potentiation. This we have studied while we had a talk about synaptic plasticity. Deep tetanizing or frequent stimuli in presynaptic neuron causes increased production of postsynaptic potential, which is lasting for minutes to hours. This is because of increased influx of calcium in the presynaptic neuron, and hence the response is potential. Long-term potentiation, when the post-tetanic potentiation, which is lasting for minutes to hours only. When the post-tetanic potentiation, which is occurring because of the pre-tetanizing stimuli in presynaptic neuron, it's much more prolonged and lasts for about hours or even longer, that is said to be long-term potentiation, and it is resulting because of increased intracellular calcium in the postsynaptic neuron rather than in the presynaptic neuron. Learning and long-term potentiation. Repeated stimulation of presynaptic neuron causes change in excitability of postsynaptic neurons, and this is by altering the rate of discharge, new protein synthesis, as well as the neurotransmitter release. These changes are found to be associated with learning as well as long-term depression, which is exactly opposite to the long-term potentiation, and it is resulting because of the slower stimulation of presynaptic neuron and thereby decrease the calcium influx and so the synaptic conduction. This phenomena is commonly seen in the hippocampus as well as in the cell. In the next session, we'll be talking about the other mechanisms which are responsible for memory as well as learning. Thank you.